Welcome to the podcast, where we journey through time and explore the ripple effects of changes in history. Today, we're diving into an alternate history where Joan of Arc never helped in the 100 Years' War. So buckle up as we embark on a journey through diary entries. Let's jump right into the first entry. This entry was dated September 12, 1348. Remember, during this time, the 100 Years' War just began. It's a long, drawn-out conflict between England and France. But this entry isn't about that war, but rather something else that's also affecting Europe's people at the time. It's about the time of the Black Death, a devastating pandemic that was spreading across the continent. In the diary entry, there's talk about how quiet and ghostly the streets are. Imagine knowing there's a war going on, but also not knowing what the next day will be like. Without medicines like nowadays, that can be very scary. In History.com, they explain how the sickness spreads. They say they know that the sickness travels from person to person through the air, as well as through the bite of an infected flea and rat. Both of these pests could be found almost everywhere in medieval Europe. Can you imagine being in the pandemic like that? We had COVID-19, but we also had the science that helped us make the medicines that, unlike in the past, they didn't have during the Black Death. So way before Joan of Arc appeared, people's lives were already in chaos. They already felt grim. Now, let's jump into the 1400s in the second entry. This entry is on October 12th. It looks like we survived the Black Death, and now we're visiting the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The Notre Dame Cathedral is a very well-known and liked cathedral. It's one of the most iconic examples of Gothic architecture, a style that reaches for the heavens, literally with its high ceilings, and figuratively by the emotions that the building evokes. The diary goes on to describe how she feels looking at the soaring ceilings and stained glass windows. Keep in mind, to see something like the Notre Dame would have been breathtaking and awe-striking, especially for somebody who's living life after the years of the Black Death, while the cathedral was being built. The next entry brings us back to what's still happening in the background. This entry dates 2 decades later, on May 15th of 1420, when the 100 Years' War is still going strong. The English was racking up victories. The French are being pressured by how much the English are gaining on them. The writer is explaining her fear during this constant attack. The writer even talks about why the kings are fighting. We have to remember that it wasn't only about the territory. According to History.com, it says that the war was about the territorial conflict, but also who was taking control of the French crown. So the war was not only about those things, but it was about national identity. Who people were looking up at for a leader, someone to give them hope about a victory. So this brings us to the last day of the journal entries, which is the year of 1429, where Joan of Arc comes into the picture. This is where things get really interesting. This is where our deep dive begins. So what if in this context, Joan of Arc never got her call, never came out to have her mission? The journal entry is from January 2nd, 1429. The writer is describing meeting a young Joan, still unknown, just trying to convince people of her mission and her call. Think about it though, at this point, France is being defeated by the English. The English have a very strong army, and the French are losing faith. And here comes this young peasant claiming she was given a message of her leading a mission for the army. You can see why people may be skeptical. In spite of that, in our timeline, Joan is able to win people over, and even the king, allowing for a victory for France. In the history press, they say several fellow women rose to her assistance, including King Charles VII's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, who helped her see the king. There's also Joan of Luxembourg, who supported her when she was captured, or Anne of Burgundy, who insisted that Joan of Arc was a virgin at her trial, as well as the very first female court writer for Charles VII, Christian Depens, who claimed Joan had a heart greater than any man's. But what happens if she never had that chance? She never met those people that backed her up. That's the question, isn't it? The French army would have most likely been demoralized by that point. So without her, the war probably dragged on even longer, with more destruction, with more suffering, with more death. But not for only the French, but also the English. Or even worse, the English might have gained an even stronger hold on France, potentially changing the entire course of European history and French history. Imagine a world where England had more power on the continent. Isn't that crazy? Think about what kind of place France would be today. What language would be dominant? What kind of culture they would have? It's weird to think about how history can change just from one person. I personally forget that history is not concrete information, but it could have been completely changed just by one sentence or action. I think that it's why what-if scenarios intrigue people. It makes us think about different roles in history, from the smallest decision to the biggest events, and how those have huge impacts. It makes you wonder about all the different paths history could have taken. For example, what if Joan did appear and gave her speeches, but the French people just weren't ready to listen? Or when Joan did give her speeches, but people thought she was crazy and just dismissed her, as she was just a child. We have to think about timing and interest and how important they are in creating the perfect scenario for change. Also, this makes me think about the French Revolution. Would that have still happened? Or the war in Algeria? Would France still have to attack Algeria? The 100 Years' War was brutal. It played a role in shaping national identities. During the war, people were forced to choose the side to identify themselves as either French or English. Without Joan of Arc, the history of France would have been very different. The dominant language may not have been French. The daily lives of the French would have been very different. French would have been with less power, as the King of England would have been in control of them. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope you take away that history, every little decision has an effect. History is not just stories of dates and names, but rather stories of people going through challenges, where every choice they made shapes the world around them and the future that we live in. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this.